Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
There's a kind of silence that hits different when it follows the sound of your own name, and it's not the kind that comes with reverence or reflection. It's the kind that slides into a room like fog, wrapping around your neck like a cold hand. That's the kind of silence I got after Steve, my boss of 17 years, stood up at my retirement party, clinked his glass with that smug little smirk, and started his speech with, "Tom was average at best, but he was reliable." The room didn't laugh. Not really. A couple of awkward chuckles, someone coughed into their drink, and I swear to God I heard someone whisper, "Jesus." I just stood there, fake smiling like it was all in good fun, holding my glass like it was the only thing keeping me from strangling him with the goddamn tie I didn't even want to wear that day. I'd put in 38 years at that company, 17 of those under Steve, the kind of man who thinks charisma is just another word for volume. And that's what I got. Average at best. He could have said anything else. He could have told a story, cracked a joke about me falling asleep in the break room that one time during inventory week, or talked about how I never took a sick day unless I looked like a walking corpse. But instead, he went with that line. Now, to be clear, I never expected fireworks or parades. I wasn't the kind of guy that ruffled feathers or kissed ass. I came in early, kept my head down, did what needed to be done, and made sure my team got credit where it was due. I didn't chase titles, and I never cared about whose name was on the glass office door. I figured that if I did right by the work and the people, that would be enough. But I was wrong. Because people like Steve, they don't respect quiet consistency. They respect noise, posturing, dominance. And they punish anything that doesn't feed their reflection. The worst part wasn't even the line itself, it was the applause after. That tepid, dry, hand-clapping like someone had just announced we were out of coffee. No one looked me in the eye. Not really. They clapped like they were being polite at a funeral for someone they'd barely known. The same people who'd leaned on me for decades, some of them fresh-faced when I trained them, couldn't even muster a cheer. It was like they were scared Steve might see them be too enthusiastic. Like celebrating me would somehow make them look average, too. I raised my glass when Steve finished his half-hearted toast, forcing the kind of grin you wear when your kid tells you they crashed your car but walked away fine. And I said one thing, only one, loud enough for the front row to hear, but not much beyond that. Here's to being average. A few more weak chuckles, some shrugs, and the party shifted into small talk and soft jazz. I stood there, watching them nibble on catered sliders and sip cheap white wine from plastic flutes like it wasn't my send-off. Like I wasn't being shoved into irrelevance with a pat on the back and a signed Hallmark card. I made the rounds because I had to, shook the hands I didn't want to shake, and gave hugs that felt more like clearance sales. Get M while you still can. Steve disappeared halfway through the party, probably off to schmooze some board member or flirt with the intern he definitely shouldn't have been making late-night Slack calls to. No one noticed. No one ever does when a guy like that ghosts the moment he's not the center of attention anymore. I stayed long enough to not seem bitter, then slipped out the side exit with my retirement gift, a set of novelty golf clubs I'd never use, seeing as I hate golf. Outside, the air was sharp for spring. My Uber pulled up with one headlight out, and I slid into the back seat, resting the clubs against the door. The driver asked if I'd had a good night, and I just said it was unforgettable, which wasn't a lie. Not in the way he thought, maybe, but unforgettable all the same. I stared out the window as the city lights blurred past, and I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in a long time: rage. Not loud, punch-a-wall rage. Not even scream into the void kind of rage. This was older, colder. The kind that simmers below the surface like an underground fire, slow and steady, waiting for the right gust of wind to rise up. Then I remembered something my son, Daniel, had said to me a couple of months back during a backyard barbecue. We were flipping burgers, and he asked if I'd ever thought about what comes after retirement. I'd shrugged, told him I'd maybe fix up the boat, maybe finally visit Alaska like I'd always promised Linda. But he just smiled and said, "You know, Dad, sometimes retirement isn't the end. Sometimes it's the opening move." At the time, I laughed it off. But now, as we turned down my street and the bitterness of Steve's speech settled deep into my bones, that line kept echoing in my head. The car rolled to a stop in front of my house, and I sat there for a second longer than necessary. Then I pulled out my phone, thumb hovering over Daniel's name in my messages. The Uber driver was watching me in the mirror, waiting to see if I was getting out. I didn't move. I typed just 2 words, no context, no lead-up, no smiley faces. Just 2 simple words. Let's do it. And I hit send. I didn't sleep that night, not really, anyway, and it wasn't because of the whine or the noise from my neighbor's busted window AC unit rattling like a death rattle in the spring air. It was something else entirely. It was the way my fingers tingled after I sent that text, the way my chest felt lighter, not because I'd let go of something, but because I'd finally picked something up. A cause, a reason, a target. Retirement, as it turns out, was the spark that finally lit the fuse I'd been too damn polite to light for decades. And the thing about quiet guys like me is that when we finally snap, it's not with shouting or slamming doors, it's surgical, slow, and permanent. The next morning, Daniel came by with a coffee and that look in his eye like he already knew what I was going to say before I even said it. He's always had that gift, reading people, knowing where the pieces are on the board before the other player even realizes they're in a game. "I figured you'd text," he said, sliding into the kitchen chair like he owned the place. "I didn't think it'd be this soon. I didn't think it'd be this clear," I told him. "But I want to hurt him, Daniel. Not physically. That'd be too simple. I want him to feel what I felt. I want to take away the thing he values most, control." Daniel smiled a little, sipping his coffee. "Then we don't build something new, Dad. We take what he already has." Back when I was in my 30s, I thought loyalty would get me everything I wanted: respect, security, maybe even a sense of belonging. I missed birthdays, skipped anniversaries, passed up job offers that would have given me a better title or a corner office. I stayed because I believed the company would remember. I thought Steve, when he took over, would remember how I stepped up during that server crash in '09, how I covered 2 departments when half the staff got laid off, how I didn't blink when he forgot to process my raise 3 years in a row. But Steve never remembered. Because Steve never noticed. I had a drawer full of those memories, quiet wins, silent sacrifices, things no one claps for, but that keep everything running. And over the years, I had started squirreling away small wins for myself, too. A modest rental property out in Columbus. A handful of safe index funds, some dividend stocks Daniel helped me understand when he was fresh out of business school. A few patents I never bragged about, just little automation tools I'd created to save my team hours every week. I sold one to a logistics firm for a decent chunk of change. Nothing flashy, nothing loud, but it stacked up. When Daniel said we could buy Steve out, I thought he was being optimistic. But the way he laid it out, it made too much sense. "If we can secure 20% of his 30% stake," he said, eyes scanning spreadsheets, "we'll have majority." I didn't even stop to check his math. I trusted him. Besides, it sounded damn poetic. Taking his own company from him with his own investors. The trick was to start quiet. We created a holding company under an old LLC I hadn't used since I helped a buddy open a bait shop in Michigan. Daniel brought in 2 friends from his VC circle, guys who hated people like Steve more than I did. One had lost a business to a crooked merger. The other had been squeezed out of his own tech startup by execs who wore the same suits as Steve and thought they owned the world. They didn't need much convincing. People like Steve always make enemies without realizing it. Then came Maya. She'd been Steve's executive assistant for the past 5 years, and while most people saw her as just another gatekeeper, I knew better. Maya saw everything. Schedules, client lists, board meeting notes, the real numbers behind the PR fluff. I bumped into her at a grocery store about 2 weeks after my retirement, and, purely by accident, or so it seemed, we ended up talking over coffee. When I told her what I was planning, she didn't blink. She said, "It's about time someone did something." We brought her in slowly, carefully. She had access to more than just Steve's calendar. She knew which investors were unhappy, which employees were thinking about jumping ship, and, most importantly, what Steve's blind spots were. Turns out, Steve had a habit of underestimating not just his staff, but his competition. That arrogance was the first crack in the dam. All we had to do was apply pressure. A few weeks in, we scheduled our first serious sit-down with a potential investor. Some ex-supply chain exec who'd made a killing in retirement flipping distressed companies. We met in this dark little steakhouse that reeked of cigars and leather chairs, the kind of place Steve would have loved. Daniel did most of the talking, running through numbers and forecasts while I sat there, quiet but attentive. Finally, the investor leaned toward me and said, "You've been awful quiet. What's your angle?" I reached into my bag and slid out a manila folder. Inside was one photo, glossy and printed from the company website. Steve, in his trademark navy blazer and fake-ass grin, standing in front of the company logo with his arms folded like he'd built the place himself. I pushed the photo across the table, met the investor's eyes, and said, "Him. I want him working for me." There's a strange kind of satisfaction in building something quietly, especially when the people you're building it against are still too wrapped up in their own self-importance to notice. It's like watching someone rearrange deck chairs on the Titanic while you're the one loosening the bolts below the surface. Steve was still riding high off a recent supplier contract he didn't negotiate but took credit for, and every week that passed made him more confident and more exposed at the same time. He'd walk into meetings with that puffed-up swagger, talking over people who actually had the numbers, joking too loudly, and reminding everyone within earshot that we run lean because we think smart. Meanwhile, one by one, I was buying the floor out from under him. The plan was never to swing for the fences all at once. We moved slow, deliberately, using proxies, shell corporations, old contacts, and in some cases, people who Steve had rubbed the wrong way so badly that just hearing his name made their lips curl. Maya coordinated a list of former executives, mid-level partners, and advisory board members who had either been pushed out under shady circumstances or left out of sheer frustration. People remembered Steve, but not fondly. His legacy wasn't loyalty or brilliance, it was resentment, stacked like bricks, just waiting for someone like me to come along with the mortar. Every deal was done quietly, under the radar, behind closed doors with papers that never had my name on them directly. I never even showed up in person unless I had to. I wanted plausible deniability until the last possible second, and Daniel made sure of that. He handled the logistics, the capital placement, the legal scaffolding that made it look like just another market adjustment. And while Steve was busy prepping for a big Q4 announcement about scaling vertical integration, we were already eating into the foundation of his empire one asset at a time. Then came the lunch. It was Maya's idea, and I hated it at first because I thought it was too risky. But she said, "He'll think it's pathetic." That's the beauty of it. And she was right. We ran into each other at a little Italian place a block and a half from the office. Steve looked up from his booth and smiled like he was seeing a sad old ghost. I forced a grin and said I'd just wrapped up a doctor's appointment nearby. He waved me over, and before I knew it, we were sharing calamari like we were old pals catching up instead of adversaries standing on either side of a chessboard. He asked about retirement, and I played it soft. Told him I was thinking about volunteering, maybe getting involved in consulting. He laughed and said, "You'd be bored in a week." I nodded along, feigning modesty, and listened as he rattled off recent wins like I hadn't already read the internal projections and investor notes from Maya's burner email. Then, halfway through the meal, he gave me that look. The one he used in meetings when he was about to make a backhanded comment sound like a compliment. "You know, Tom," he said, stirring his iced tea, "I always thought you had a good heart. A real steady Eddie. That's rare these days." And I just smiled, tilting my head slightly, and said, "Appreciate that, Steve. Coming from you, that means a lot." He grinned, like a lion who thinks he just made a kill, and I excused myself soon after, leaving behind my half-eaten pasta and the growing urge to flip the table and tell him he'd just complimented the man who was dismantling his kingdom from the inside out. After that, we picked up the pace. Investor number 5 had once been on the short list for VP of Sales until Steve brought in an outsider who lasted 6 months and left with a severance bigger than her performance bonus. He joined us without hesitation. Number 6 was an old client who had stopped renewing contracts 2 years ago after a botched rollout that Steve blamed on legacy staff. The man shook my hand and said, "It's about damn time someone came for him." And through it all, Maya kept feeding us breadcrumbs, financials, meeting summaries, internal friction reports, every leak a tiny puncture in Steve's already thinning armor. At one point, I asked her why she was helping so much, what she got out of it. And she looked at me with something that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite admiration and said, "Because you weren't average, Tom. You were the only grown-up in the building." That hit me harder than I expected. Maybe because it was the first time someone actually saw what I'd done without me having to wave a flag or write a memo. Maybe because it made me realize just how much I'd accepted being invisible as a kind of badge of honor. But mostly, it lit a fire in me that burned cleaner than anger. It was purpose, pure and simple. Then came the cookies. I baked a batch from an old family recipe, oatmeal walnut chocolate chip, the kind Linda used to make for the kids when the weather turned. I walked into the office like a retiree just stopping by to say hello. Everyone smiled, half of them uncomfortable, unsure what to say. A few people hugged me like they were hugging a memory. Steve was out at a meeting, and I used the time to walk the floor, chat up old faces, and scope out the main conference room, specifically its capacity, its projection setup, and the nameplate on the door. It wouldn't be as much longer. By the time I got back to my car, Daniel had already sent a message. Signed. Done. Contract mailed this morning. He's being outbid. I stared down at my phone, rereading those last 2 words like they were poetry. Badly. Badly, he said. Steve Carlisle, the man who humiliated me on my way out the door, was about to learn the hard way what happens when you build your kingdom on arrogance and forget that quiet people can still move mountains behind your back. And this time, I wouldn't be raising a glass. I'd be raising the floor underneath his feet. The funny thing about power is that it doesn't scream when it enters the room, it whispers, shifts the air, and suddenly the people who thought they were untouchable start looking over their shoulders for shadows that weren't there before. That's exactly what was happening to Steve during those final days, though of course, he didn't know it was me, not at first. He just knew something was wrong, something was moving beneath him, and for a man like Steve who relied entirely on control, that uncertainty was like a cancer spreading through every polished surface of his carefully curated empire. The legal filings were timed with precision, each acquisition folded into the next like a hand of cards laid out just long enough for the table to flip. Daniel had built a network of holding companies so layered and faceless it looked like a hedge fund mating with a spiderweb, and Maya had provided just enough intel to keep us ahead of every whisper Steve heard in the boardroom halls. By the time he realized shares were changing hands, it was already too late to freeze anything without drawing attention to the cracks forming in the ceiling above him. I could tell from Maya's messages that he was unraveling, holding emergency Zoom meetings with half-baked agendas, snapping at junior analysts for typos in internal reports, asking vague questions about ownership fluctuation, and getting non-answers from people too scared to admit they didn't know what the hell was going on. You could feel it in the emails, in the way his tone changed from smug to strained. One memo even ended with, "Let's tighten the sails before this turns into something serious." Too bad for him, the storm had already made landfall. The call came on a Thursday morning, Daniel's voice steady but electric. "It's done, Dad," he said, and I could practically hear the grin stretching across his face. "We've got controlling interest. 43% through proxies. Another 8 in soft commitments." I asked him if Steve knew yet, and he said, if he doesn't now, he will by lunch. Sure enough, by noon, Steve was on the phone with everyone he still thought he could lean on: old investors, advisory board members, legal counsel who owed him favors from golf trips and backdoor dinners. But it was all noise. The ink had dried. The weight had shifted. The company announcement went out at 3 o'clock sharp, written in that dry, corporate tone that masks revolutions with phrases like strategic reorganization and long-term stewardship transition. But the headline couldn't hide the truth: new ownership. Effective immediately. I walked into that building like I was visiting a ghost town. Everything looked the same: Same receptionist, same elevator smell, same awful taupe carpeting that probably hadn't been replaced in a decade, but the air felt different, like it was holding its breath. I rode the elevator to the 30th floor alone, passing floors I hadn't seen since the last fire drill 2 years before retirement. The higher I went, the more I could feel it, that low, humming buzz of justice warming my bones. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't anxious. I was calm in a way I hadn't been in years. When the elevator doors opened, Steve was already waiting. He looked smaller than I remembered, his suit a little too crisp, his expression a little too sharp, like a cornered animal trying to pretend it still had options. Behind him, the boardroom door stood open, a dozen faces inside pretending not to stare. "What the hell is this, Tom?" he asked, voice too controlled to be casual. I didn't say anything. I just walked past him, slow and deliberate, like I had all the time in the world. Inside the room, Daniel stood at the far end of the table, nodding at me with the kind of pride that only comes from watching your old man do something no one thought he could. I took my seat, folded my hands, and let the silence hang for a long moment before saying, "Thanks for holding the seat warm, Steve." He didn't sit. He paced. "You can't seriously expect me to report to you," he said, voice rising, each word more bitter than the last. I leaned in across the table, meeting his eyes with the calm he never once showed me in 17 years, and I said, "I don't. You're not reporting to anyone. You're fired." The words landed like a slap. No ceremony, no grandstanding. Just 4 syllables and a final period. The kind of clean, surgical statement he'd once used on others when he thought they weren't useful anymore. Only now, he was on the other side of the table, and I was the one holding the knife. He didn't say anything at first. His jaw clenched, his knuckles white as he gripped the back of the nearest chair. You could see the wheels spinning, trying to find a loophole, an exit, a reason this wasn't happening. But there was nothing left for him to grab. The ground was gone. The office he stood in was mine now. The faces around the table belonged to people who'd stopped fearing him the moment the tide turned. He stormed out without another word, the glass door swinging behind him with a thud that echoed like a closing chapter. The room stayed quiet. No one clapped. No one moved. It was the kind of silence I had felt once before, at my retirement party, but this time, it wasn't hollow or cold. It was earned. Weighted. Final. And as he disappeared down the hallway, red-faced and shaking, I caught Maya's reflection in the boardroom glass. She didn't smile outright. Not really, but there was something in her eyes. That knowing look. Like she'd just watched a house of cards finally collapse into itself after holding its breath for too long. We didn't say a word to each other. We didn't have to. 6 months after I fired Steve Carlisle in front of a dozen stunned board members and walked out of that building with the weight of 38 years finally lifted off my back, the company was not only intact, it was thriving in a way it hadn't seen in decades. It's almost funny, the way things stabilized when we stopped treating people like tools and started treating them like, well, people. The panic Steve predicted, the so-called vacuum of leadership, never showed up. In fact, it turned out that the real vacuum had been the years we spent following a man who thought loudness meant leadership and fear meant loyalty. I didn't run things the way he did. I didn't sit in on every call, didn't bark down the hall for weekly updates, didn't treat every staff meeting like it was the damn Super Bowl. I showed up twice a week, kept the coffee hot, and let people do the jobs they were hired to do. And surprise, surprise, they did them better without a guy breathing down their necks like a debt collector with a stopwatch. Maya stepped into a leadership role almost overnight, and watching her grow into it was like seeing a dam finally break. She didn't need me telling her what to do. Hell, half the time, she was the one telling me. Daniel took over financial strategy, built out a small team of quiet killers who knew the markets better than I ever would, and started putting money back into departments that Steve had been draining for years to make his quarterlies look good. Morale went up, turnover dropped, clients returned. We even rehired 2 engineers who had quit under Steve and said they'd never come back unless the place was washed in holy water. Apparently, my ownership qualified. And yet, Through all that, I never gloated. Not once. I didn't take out ads or post grand declarations on LinkedIn about comebacks or winning the long game. But I did one thing that gave me more satisfaction than any speech ever could. I sent out Christmas cards. Handwritten, real cards, not just some pre-printed garbage with glitter and cursive fonts. I sent one to every department, every vendor, every former employee I could remember. And yes, I sent one to Steve. I wrote 2 lines in it, wishing you peace and clarity. Warm regards, Tom Bennett. No bitterness, no dig. Just enough to remind him that I was still here. And that I wasn't angry anymore. Because anger meant he still mattered, and he didn't. Not really. I didn't expect to see him again. I figured he'd moved on, maybe tried to start something new or disappeared into some consulting gig where people still believed his version of things. But life's funny like that. It has a way of circling back when you least expect it and putting you face to face with the very thing you thought you'd buried for good. It was a Thursday morning, colder than usual, and I was in the break room making a fresh pot of coffee because the last guy forgot to hit the clean cycle and left it tasting like burnt socks. The place was quiet, people just starting to filter in, light spilling across the floor from the big east-facing windows we'd finally had cleaned. I was wearing an old sweater Linda used to hate and sneakers that had seen too many home improvement projects, just another quiet morning in the company I now owned. Then I saw him. He was standing in the lobby just outside the glass, staring in with that hesitant, unsure look people get when they're trying to decide if they've made a huge mistake but are already too far in to turn back. His suit wasn't bad, but it wasn't crisp either. The collar drooped a little. The tie looked like it had been knotted one too many times. And the confidence he used to wear like a badge of honor was gone, replaced by something smaller, quieter. Something I recognized all too well, uncertainty wrapped in pride. He walked in like a man stepping onto a frozen lake, every step measured, like the floor might give out from under him. I saw a few heads turn, a few jaws drop, but no one said anything. He walked straight to the break room, and when our eyes met, there wasn't anger. Not really. Just a kind of exhaustion that neither of us could fake our way through. "Hey, Tom," he said, clearing his throat like he was choking down the last of his pride. "Just wondering, you hiring?" I didn't answer right away. I just poured 2 coffees, both black, just how he used to drink it before he switched to oat milk and French vanilla creamer to impress the younger staff. I slid one across the counter to him, and he took it without a word. "There's a janitor role opening next week," I said, finally breaking the silence. "Pay's honest. Good hours. No politics." He looked at me, and for a second, I couldn't tell if he was insulted or relieved. Maybe both. He sipped the coffee, nodded once, and looked around the room like he was seeing it for the first time, like it wasn't his anymore, and maybe, deep down, he understood that it never really was. We didn't speak after that. He just stood there for a minute, coffee in hand, and then walked out the same way he came in, quietly, without ceremony, like someone trying not to wake a sleeping house. I never told anyone whether I hired him or not. Some people asked, mostly in whispers, like they were afraid the answer might change how they saw me. But I never answered, because the truth wasn't really the point. Funny thing, people remember speeches. They remember the words you said and the way you said them, whether you stuttered, whether you smiled, whether you made them laugh or made them squirm. But they never forget silence. Not the kind that lingers, not the kind that echoes, not the kind that shows up in a break room 6 months after you fired a man from the company he thought he owned. And sometimes silence is the only answer that matters.